Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the DWSRF and Capacity Building and Action webinar series. Today, we will be discussing source water protection. As people are starting to join our webinar this afternoon, we wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So first, all attendees are in listen-only mode. Please do not unmute yourself throughout the presentation. We will also be recording this webinar, so please do not turn on your video during the presentation. A copy of the slides would be later attached in the chat box, and the recording will be posted on our drinking water training webpage and a link emailed to all registered attendees about 1 to 2 weeks after the webinar. For more information about our drinking water trainings and webinars, you can go to our drinking water training webpage on epa.gov. We also encourage attendees to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the chat feature. You can access the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and a chat box should pop up. You can type in your questions at the bottom. Please direct any of your questions to the Q&A moderator. This way we don't necessarily flood questions to everybody that is attending the webinar. And also, if you have any technical issues throughout the webinar, you could also type in your questions or any difficulties also directed at the Q&A moderator, and they should help troubleshoot any difficulties that you're experiencing. So as we're still having people joining the webinar, we wanted to take a really quick poll. The first question is going to be, what is your affiliation? So state, federal agency, technical assistant provider, association, or other. The second question would be, which water program are you associated with? So capacity development, the state revolving fund, source water protection, or other, or maybe not applicable. And then what is your familiarity with today's subject matter? If you're familiar, somewhat familiar, or if you're an expert. So I'll give a couple more seconds, making sure everyone has the time to fill out this quick poll. All right, I'll give 10 more seconds for everybody to fill out the poll. So again, what is your affiliation? Which water program are you associated with? And what is your level of familiarity with today's subject matter? All right, I think we can end the poll now. So majority of you guys are representing the state agency, followed by the federal agency and technical assistant providers. Most people are not associated with source water protection, SRF, or capacity development, but it seems pretty much even across the board. And it seems like most of you guys have some familiarity with today's subject matter of how to build capacity by using the SRF set-asides to fund source water protection. All righty. So today we have a really great webinar for you guys. We have Kara Goodwin from EPA headquarters, who's going to talk about how to leverage the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund set-asides for source water protection. And then we have 2 states to present on how they're using their set-asides in their drinking water protection programs, both from Tennessee and North Carolina. We have Brian Ham, Vina Jones from Tennessee, and Danny Edwards from North Carolina. And as I mentioned before, we hope to have enough time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions in the chat box and direct message that to Q&A moderator. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Kara.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to be here and speaking with you, which is one of my favorite topics to present on and to discuss and to work with. We've got a great staff here at EPA headquarters. We collaborate very closely on the SRF and source water protection. So I'm happy to present with you and to hear the great stories from Tennessee and North Carolina. So first, a little background on what is source water protection. Here at EPA, we think of source water protection. Well, I gotta move myself here. All right, so I can see my notes. We think of source water protection as the first line of defense and a multi-barrier approach to clean drinking water. The other pieces of this puzzle are risk management through proper water treatment and risk monitoring and compliance. The multi-barrier approach builds protection so that even if one of these barriers was to fail, as long as the other two barriers are still in place, it is likely public health will not be compromised. At the federal level, source water protection is voluntary. I'll talk a little bit more about the history of the source water protection program on our next slide. But in general, we think of it at the federal level as voluntary. However, your state or local governments may have their own requirements. Finally, we think of source water protection as a watershed investment program, knowing that it needs to be financially compelling and should be viewed as an investment with multiple benefits. The returns on investment, the risks mitigated, the protection and water quality benefits achieved need to be substantial enough to justify the risk of the investment while comparing it to other options such as treatment or developing a new source of water. However, I hope you'll see from the presentations today that relatively small investments, including those available from the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund set-asides, can have a large impact. And we really encourage states and local areas to leverage these set-asides throughout their planning process, to have a long-term vision for their source water protection, and to think about combining all the water quality programs and opportunities that we have to protect source water. So the Source Water Protection Program was established in the 1996 amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act, which required states to set up source water protection programs and conduct source water assessments. This was kind of what we call a one and done process. There are no requirements in CIDWA to update source water assessments. So over the past 20 years, understandably, landscapes have changed. Our knowledge in general has changed on source water threats. We are aware of new emerging contaminants. There are increasing rates of degradation to ecosystems, such as harmful algal blooms. But we also have new tools and technology available to help us assess our source water protection areas, such as the prevalence of GIS mapping now. EPA has a great tool I'll plug here called DW Maps that contains a lot of different data layers that can be used for source water assessments. There are a lot of tools out there, and oops, not ready. One of our messages these days is that when you update your source water assessments, if you update and when you update, and we encourage that you do, that they don't just sit on a server or sit on a shelf, that you use these assessments, turn them into action plans, and use funding such as that available from the set-asides to implement the actions in your source water protection plans. In 2018, just a couple of years ago, Congress recognized the need for updates to source water assessments by changing the language related to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund set-asides and explicitly including updates to source water assessments in the eligibilities for the set-asides, along with some other changes, which I will talk about. Looking at our poll this morning. Some of you are from SRF programs, but many of you aren't. So I'll just give a very brief overview of the State Revolving Fund Program, which is first and foremost a public health protection program. It's a federal-state partnership designed to create in each state a perpetual source of financing for drinking water infrastructure. And it was modeled after the successful Clean Water SRF, but there are some notable modifications. So the drinking water SRF cycle begins with a federal capitalization grant that is authorized and approved by Congress each year. That grant is distributed to state DWSRF programs according to the needs survey that is conducted every 4 years. Then the state provides a 20% match and acts as the bank for drinking water infrastructure loans. The DWSRF loans have low interest rates and may be paid back over a 30-year period. As loans are repaid, the principal and interest go back into the fund, sustaining the fund for more infrastructure loans. An important aspect for the DWSRF is the availability of set-aside funds. These are not a part of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. These are optional expenditures of the capitalization grant, of the CAP grant funds by the states for specific non-infrastructure programs. These monies that are set aside do not go into the loan fund and do not revolve. A couple of years ago, so between FY fiscal year 2017 and 2018, the America's Water Infrastructure Act signed in November of 2018. Sorry, let me restate that. That the national appropriation increased the CAP grant for the DWSRF by 34% between FY 2017 and 2018. The America's Water Infrastructure Act signed in 2018 authorized additional increase in the CAP grants, but I believe, and we can perhaps cover this in the Q&A session, the CAP grants have remained relatively steady after that initial increase between 2017 and 2018. But that 2017-2018 increase was substantial. So the set-aside funds that we're discussing here are based on a percentage of the CAP grant that each state gets. So as the CAP grant increases, there's more money available for set-asides. So what are these set-asides? Like I mentioned, they are optional for states. And they are intended to support activities necessary to ensure safe and affordable drinking water. They provide states with flexible tools to assist water systems and improve public health protection, to extend and enhance the impact of drinking water state revolving fund funding, and to sustain the day-to-day operations of states' drinking water programs. The set-aside should complement infrastructure financing, strengthen the public water system supervision program, and also implement the 3 preventative programs: capacity development, operator certification, and source water protection, which we were talking about today. So there are 4 different set-asides listed in the State Drinking Water Act, and we're going to talk about these last 2 today. And this little teeter-totter here is an illustration that it's a balancing act for the states when they're deciding on which set-asides to take and how much to take for those set-asides. And because, as I mentioned, money that is used for set-asides does not go into the loan program and does not return into the revolving loan fund. So the state program management is the first set-aside we'll be talking about. It is 10% of the CAP grant can be used for this set-aside. It can be used to develop and implement drinking water protection, capacity development, operator certification, and source water protection programs. Most commonly, we see this fund, this set-aside used to fund staff for the source water protection program, or for source water protection is most commonly used to fund staff, such as source water coordinators and hydrogeologists. It can also be used by the state for source water protection activities. The second, and maybe more commonly used for source water activities and on the ground source water protection work, is the local assistance and other state programs set aside, or the 15% set aside. It can be used for 4 different areas. The first is loans to public water systems for source water protection, land acquisition or easements, and voluntary or incentive-based source water protection measures. Can also be used for source water petition programs. However, none of our states have used it for this purpose. The next eligibility is the delineation, assessment, and updates to assessments for source water protection areas. The italicized text on this slide indicates the changes that were made in that 2018 legislation to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the updates to assessments was a change made by Congress. Next, it can be used to provide assistance as part of a capacity development strategy. And then finally, it can be used for the establishment and implementation of wellhead protection programs and implementation of efforts to protect source water. And again, as you can see, that last phrase there is italicized, indicating that this language was changed in 2018. Previously, this final eligibility only addressed wellhead protection programs. And now the eligibility is much broader and includes a wide variety of efforts to protect source water. So some examples of the types of activities that the states can use this 15% set aside for source water protection are listed here. This is just a limited listing here. There are a lot of different examples, and you'll be hearing them from Tennessee and North Carolina today. But I wanted to give just a few examples here. So developing source water protection plans. Like we said, the CIDWA required source water assessments, but nothing beyond that. So we think it's important for states and local utilities and communities to have source water protection plans, actionable plans that they can work with to implement protection of their drinking water sources. Many states have set up small grant programs. So the state can decide what the eligibilities of those are and hold a competitive or kind of first come, first serve process for those small grants. Many states also choose to contract with a technical assistance provider. We also use them for the implementation of best management practices. This picture here is some cover crops around high-risk public wells in Delaware. This was a project that Delaware piloted, partnering with the local communities to make sure that all their wellhead protection areas had cover crops. Updating their source water assessments with GIS or other new technologies. Most of these assessments were done in the early 2000s, and we've learned a lot since then. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of new technologies to improve the quality of the source water assessments available. You can use the money to develop local ordinances, such as controlling different types of land use or activities and wellhead protection areas or source water protection areas. And finally, public outreach and education. There's a lot of that states are involved in as well to really engage with the public and help them understand why it's important to protect their local sources of drinking water. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's important to have, to think long-term when it comes to source water protection. Investing in development of a source water protection plan can go a long way, because that helps you identify the needs and the funding sources that can help you accomplish those needs in the future. And during this process, it's important to account for multiple benefits. Many of our source water protection partners access funds through other programs, such as the Section 319 non-point source grants or clean water SRF loans. So through this long-term planning, you can identify what your goals are and help you set up the steps that you need to take to access these other sources of funding. Overall, an investment in set-aside funds, using your set-aside funds for this planning can be an on-ramp for larger funding opportunities. So to wrap up, now is the time for conversations between your source water protection programs and drinking water SRF programs about opportunities to dedicate set-aside money for source water protection. We fully understand that this is voluntary for states, but we hope states recognize the importance of source water protection and the value and the impact that using your set-aside funds for source water protection can have. So I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues in your DWSRF and your source water protection programs, depending where you may lie in your organization. Just as a process note, states submit a set-aside work plan as part of their CAP grant application every year. So that is kind of a touch point that you can start a conversation and think about how the opportunities for using set-asides for source water protection. And then using the set-asides to identify priority areas and systems to update the assessments and develop plans for those. So that's where our source water protection and non-point source colleagues can come into play to help identify these priority areas. So that's it for me today. I just wanted to give a quick overview and looking forward to hearing from our state colleagues. So I'm going to pass it off to Dina Jones and Brian Ham from the state of Tennessee.
Thank you, Kara. I appreciate it. I'm going to, let's see, share my screen now. Oh, where's this? Here we go. Give me a moment. Share.
And as we're waiting there, I want to just remind you that if you have questions, you can drop them to the Q&A moderator in the chat box.
Kara, are you seeing my title slide?
Yes, I am.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, EPA, for inviting Tennessee to talk about our synergy between the State Revolving Fund Program and our source water protection efforts in the drinking water program. The State Revolving Fund and the Source Water Protection Program within drinking water are both housed within the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation in the Division of Water Resources. So Brian Ham and I have the luxury of working within the same division that really has helped facilitate and foster growth in our source water protection. So we're excited to talk to you today about our program. In 2019, the SRF had a reevaluation of our program since we had changes organizationally and knew there were a whole bunch of new allowances for the use of funding with AWIA and so on. So we kind of revisited our strategic use of funds to look at how SRF could partner to strengthen source water protection program and increase use of set-asides for source water protection projects. By taking those expanded use of funds and looking at the TDEC mission and priorities to protect human health and safety in the environment, as well as the Division of Water Resource mission and priorities to provide good, clean drinking water and improve water quality in general. For Tennessee, we really wanted to take a slow approach to understanding what we could do and what there was interest in doing in terms of expanding their use of our set-asides through source water protection. So in the summer of 2019, we gathered a team of multi-agency partners across the division and in the department, including the drinking water program, engineering services, stormwater, members from our commissioner's office and policy office, and other agencies that worked in the same space to talk about what were the priorities for the state, what were some of the most pressing issues we could see. And out of that meeting, we got a list of a whole bunch of items that we thought we could focus on the next few years to decade, right? On elements that were most vital to making sure our drinking water program and our systems throughout the state were high functioning. And lucky for us, source water protection was one of those items that the advisory committee we gathered thought was worthy of expanding our work. So the tale of SRF and the expansion in the use of set-asides is really one about taking a kind of a slow, I don't want to say slow, but taking a measured approach and getting feedback from the technical advisory group. And then in state fiscal year 2020 to present, we started including source water protection goals in our intended use plan. This gave us the opportunity to ensure we had transparency with all of our stakeholders about what direction we were taking. In state fiscal year 2020, we also started identifying the priorities that the drinking water program felt secure in executing, one step at a time. Brian and I have also been partnering with in developing conversations with the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, where the 319 non-point source program is housed, and looking at how we can leverage and collaborate on projects that answer both issues, non-point source issues, as well as source water protection. In state fiscal year 2021, we actually expanded our use of the local assistance set aside. Tennessee is not unlike many states. We do not maximize our set aside allowances. So this was our opportunity to really start growing the use of that designated pot of money to put towards protection efforts. We anticipate as we continue the process to review the statute and ranking system for the drinking water program and hopefully do updates to those programs in state fiscal year 2022 or 2023. And really some of the targeted work with that would be to build a funding mechanism through the local assistance set aside to provide loans or grants for land acquisition and conservation projects. We know that building that funding mechanism can be a really complex process, so we want to get our foundational elements in place. But right now, we're really focused on the great work that Brian Ham and his group is executing at this point to really take the strategy and put it to work. Brian?
Thanks, Vina. That was a great summary. I appreciate it. And just to start off, appreciate everybody being here today, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. This has really, truly been the most exciting and rewarding portion of the work that I've been able to be a part of at the state. And so just want to highlight that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I get into the SRF synergy portion of my presentation here in just a moment. But I wanted to give everyone a little bit more of a background about our source water protection program in the state. And as Kara highlighted earlier, we had done a statewide source water assessment in the early, late 1990s and early 2000s. And the latest version of that report is dated 2003 in Tennessee. And so when we were starting to think about improvements, that was one of the things that we definitely highlighted when we were engaging with SRF on this opportunity. So this is a rule reference to our source water protection program. Public water systems are required to submit source water protection plans to the state of Tennessee on a 3-year basis. And so those plans include a variety of different things, including potential contaminant sources, as well as emergency contact information and so forth for contingency planning. Those regulations are split up into two different categories, splitting those into surface water sources, as well as groundwater sources. And next slide. So for surface water sources in the state of Tennessee, our critical source water protection zone extends 5 miles upstream of the intake and a half a mile downstream, and then 1,000-foot corridor on the banks of the stream that the intake is located on. So that is the critical source water protection zone. That is what these public water systems are using to map their potential contaminant sources that they include in the plans. And they can also use those designations this is kind of the minimum designation. They're also able to reach further into the watershed or a wider corridor if they see fit. You see also the definition there for significant potential contaminant sources. And so these are the things that we're looking for them to include in their plans as far as any recognized potential contaminants in those different areas. And next slide. So here's just kind of a visual of how many source water protection areas and the extent of source water protection areas across the state. You can see that there are much of the land across the state does encounter and intersect source water protection areas. And I always love the every little towns and every city's little placards that they may include near their stormwater drains to remind the public about being in a source water protection area. And next slide. So wellhead protection areas are for the groundwater sources, of course, and putting much more emphasis on a larger area around those different wells or springs in the area. One significant thing in the state of Tennessee is that we have a very significant portion of the state is covered in karst geology. And so with those rapid transport mechanisms in the subsurface, that the protection of the wellhead protection areas as well as wellhead groundwater protection areas around springs becomes a very important factor in delineation of those areas as well. So if you can go to the next slide, Vina. Much of the area in Western Tennessee is porous media aquifer. And so in those sandy and silty soils, the wellhead protection areas are modeled differently. They are modeled with programs like WHAM or ModFlow or any other types of state approved modeling mechanisms. And so those are uniform flow models. The hydrogeology is much more predictable. You get a much more predictable area around the well and so forth. But as you step into the middle portions of the state and the eastern portions of the state, that karst hydrogeology kind of takes hold, and you start to see a different type of mapping for wellhead protection areas and groundwater protection areas around those features. And so in those areas, we're actually using more empirical methods, potentially dye tracing or other hydrogeologic evaluations to figure out what is the appropriate area to model for groundwater protection. And yeah, that's fine. So when these systems are submitting contaminant source inventories, you saw the definition previously, and you're probably familiar with a similar process in each of your states. But one of the things that came up when we were looking at plans that were submitted was the variety to the extent that that systems were mapping these sites, or the way that they were submitting information in different ways, or including sites that one system may include and the other one may not. And so getting back to that 2003 statewide source water assessment, we were comparing apples to apples. We were looking at the same types of sites for all the way across all the way across the state. We were able to do a much better vulnerability assessment and kind of see who rose to the top as far as potential concerns. As Kara mentioned, that data is very old, and so we were looking to create a way to not only update that source water assessment across the state, but also to put that information into the hands of the public water systems. So next slide. So it was 2019 when I attended the Groundwater Protection Council's annual forum in Oklahoma City, and there was a very good 2-hour presentation, or a 2-hour block of time for looking at, I forget the exact name of the session, but Kara gave a great presentation, very similar to what she gave today, highlighting the use of drinking water set-asides. And that caught my attention right off the bat. She was the first presenter. And then we had another presentation, and then the states did lightning rounds for states that had information where they had leveraged the use of these funds. One of the states that really caught my eye was in Arkansas. They had updated their statewide source water assessment using geographic information systems. They had collaborated with the USGS on this project. And so I immediately made a beeline to the table, to Arkansas's table, directly after their presentation to pick their brain, figure out exactly what they had done, and get some more information about how we may be able to leverage similar resources in the state of Tennessee. So thank you, Kara, for that presentation. And if there's anybody from Arkansas on the line, you can pat everybody on the back because you've done a great job there as well. So on the way home, if you can just go back for one more second, Vina. When I was coming home from that conference, it really took hold with me that this should be a priority in my position to come back and discuss this opportunity with our leadership and our SRF director as well. And so I started to formulate some of these ideas and how this would start to come together. Sat down with all of those key personnel, Vina included, and created some kind of agreement and to figure out how we were going to address this and to improve our program. As we started having those discussions, then we were challenged to kind of really put that on paper and say, you know, what exactly do we want to do, and who can we work with to provide some expert technical support. And I'd already known that USGS had worked with Arkansas, so and I had some contacts at USGS, so we started to have some initial discussions about what that might look like. And so there you'll see on the first objective, we quickly highlighted that the GIS analysis for an updated statewide source water assessment was really the biggest objective that we really wanted to tackle. I mentioned a minute ago the karst geology in the state during severe drought times that can really have an impact on public water systems, and looking at the observation wells that we have in aquifers across the state. There had been some historical work, and there were some historical wells that were monitored, but over time the funding had been dropped from some of those key aquifers throughout the state, especially the ones that are in karst areas and can be more vulnerable. There's a lot of real-time observation wells are more focused in the western portions of the state. The Memphis Aquifer is also a big resource within our state and is in the porous media portion, but really started to realize that in these other middle and eastern portions of the state that we really need to put some energy back into monitoring observation wells in that portion to help these public water systems monitor drought conditions and plan and look at historical information and kind of pre-plan for drought conditions in those areas. So that you see in objective 2, where we're collaborating with USGS for some additional real-time observation wells in those aquifers. And then 3 is another component looking at the unique hydrogeology in the state. So we have a lot of systems that are also using karst springs and other karst aquifers in the state for public water system supply. And so we're taking a very close look at the recharge areas that are currently or were historically mapped during the previous statewide assessment, or any plans that were submitted thereafter, and seeing if we can gain some technical assistance with evaluating those areas and any work that may need to be done with regard to hydrogeologic assessments or dye tracing in that area to improve the recharge area mapping for those systems and those sources. And next slide. So we've already been, we entered this 5-year, initially we had decided that we were going to campaign for, get agreement with SRF to have 1 year funding and do the source water assessment. When we started to, thanks Allison, and when we started to work through that, we engaged with them, and it turned out that they were interested in entering a 5-year agreement and contributing funding themselves to our project. And so after that, we were able to establish a 5-year joint funding agreement for those 3 objectives that you just saw. And so we're already working with their group. They have experience with GIS and this type of modeling, as I mentioned. And so this is the initial component where we'll be working in developing a unique module for having a geographic information systems model to update that statewide source water assessment. And the plan is for us to come out of that project with something that we can use going forward. It won't be a static snapshot. We can use that going forward into future years. And next slide. Again, here's just a quick snapshot of what we'll be doing to monitor the water levels and other observation wells and springs in the state to support those drought condition monitoring for public water systems. And next slide. And then again, just the recharge area evaluation. We've created kind of a matrix of scoring these the recharge areas that are already mapped for public water systems, looking at what validity of those areas that have already been delineated and trying to prioritize which ones may need additional work. And I believe, oh yeah, so all of this is to further leverage our synergy and support from other partners. As Bina mentioned already, we work closely with the 319B program to provide input on proposed projects that people propose to them, as well as USDA, NRCS through the Farm Bill allocations, Nature Conservancy, and then our Tennessee Association of Utility Districts as well. And I believe the next slide is just some information for contact information for Vina Jones and myself. If you have any questions, feel free to either ask during this meeting or take our information down and contact us later. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you guys. And again, remember any questions that you may have, you can send it to the Q&A moderator in the chat. And now we have Danny from North Carolina.
Okay, thank you, Allison. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're located in the country, to discuss our drinking water protection program in North Carolina and how we use the drinking water state revolving fund set-asides to accomplish our goals in drinking water protection. Can you guys see my slides now?
Yes, we can see them.
Is it in presentation mode?
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome, great. And I do work with the public water supply section in North Carolina. We are part of the Division of Water Resources, which is also part of our North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Let's see. Okay, there we go. I wanted to give a quick overview of how we're using our set-asides. They are really a significant source of funding to help us accomplish our drinking water protection goals here in North Carolina, whether it be funding for positions or funding for contracts and that type thing. And I'm going to go over our various program initiatives that we're involved in that are supported by the set-asides. Initially, I'm going to start out talking about our source water assessment program and the model update. Our source water assessment program is based on a GIS model, and we are in the process of doing a comprehensive update to that. Then I'm also going to talk about our source water protection planning, both from a voluntary standpoint and our state mandatory source water protection requirements. Then I'm going to talk about our wellhead protection program. And following that, I will discuss our source water collaborative awards program and our collaboration with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So essentially all these initiatives that we're involved in are supported by the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. First off, on our source water assessment program or our SWAP program, we do update our reports approximately every 2 years. Sometimes it may be 3, but we do try to update those at that frequency. And when we do that, we also update our PCS inventory, or our potential contaminant source inventory is also updated by using state and federal regulatory databases. Our current SWAT reports, we do make those available through our drinking water protection website. We do have an interactive mapping application that the public can use for accessing source water assessment program data. And this is just a screenshot of our drinking water protection website specific to the source water assessment program. And there are various links there to information on the source water assessment, links to access our reports, which is the third link, and then a link to access our source water assessment mapping tool, which is the fourth link. And that is the most comprehensive way to view our source water assessment data. And this is just a screenshot of that source water assessment mapping tool. The users can go in and they can access various data layers using the layer list that's shown here on the right to view SWAP data, whether it be locations of source water, public water supply sources, or assessment areas, or PCS locations, either by PCS category, such as NPDES permits or animal operations, et cetera, or viewing all the PCSs in a combined layer. And there's also links at the top for accessing SWAP reports and some other information. So, you know, we've put quite a bit of work in developing this online mapping application to present the data to the public on our SWAP program. And now I want to switch and kind of talk about our SWAP update, model update that we're currently involved in now. As I said, we do update our SWAP reports, but we're also now looking at doing a comprehensive updating of the SWAP model itself, the GIS-based model that is used to calculate the final susceptibility ratings. In doing that, we are going to incorporate more recent data. Obviously, some of the data does change over time, such as the land use, land cover, that does change. And I think the last update that we had to some of that type data was back in 2009. So we are looking at doing an update to that data, but also we're looking at changing some of the components of the model and how the susceptibility, final susceptibility rating is determined for areas that we've identified as being in need of improvement over what was done originally when the model was originally created. And just to give you some examples on what we're working with on our SWAP model update, our final susceptibility ratings in the SWAP program are based on 2 parameters, one being the contaminant rating, which is basically determined based on the number and type of PCS is located in the assessment areas. And then the second parameter that goes into that final susceptibility rating is what we call the inherent vulnerability rating, which is based on landscape characteristics such as land use, land cover, slope, as well as annual average precipitation, things that affect either facilitate the transport of contaminants or mitigate the transport of contaminants. So those are the 2 sides of our SWAP model in how our final susceptibility rating is determined. And our current method, one of the things we're looking at making a drastic overhaul is on the contaminant rating side. As I said earlier, it is based on the number and type of PCSs or potential contaminant sources in the assessment area, independent of the size of the assessment area. And what we would like to do now is to make that more equitable by using a density, PCS density calculation, where the number of PCSs are divided by the assessment area size to get a PCS density. So we're actively involved. That's just a good example of what we're doing, trying to update our SWAT model and make it more relevant. The second bullet here, our unsaturated zone rating and watershed characteristic rating, that's part of the inherent vulnerability side of the model. We have updated that in the past. Like I said earlier, in 2009, we actually had a contract with USGS at that time to update these component data layers that go into calculating these ratings. And we are currently looking at setting up another contract with USGS to do that update. And obviously the drinking water set-asides are going to be supportive in that effort as well. We're doing some updates to how our groundwater assessment areas are delineated. We use a calculated fixed radius method for that delineation. We're looking at revamping that or updating that, making some tweaks there. Our groundwater source rating, which is also part of the inherent vulnerability side of the model, we're looking at updating that. Historically, that is used for groundwater sources, and historically, that has been determined based on the depth of the well. It is essentially a way that we characterize how protected the aquifer is that the well is drawing water from. And like I say, we've used well depth as a proxy to determine or to rate how protective the aquifer is, with the assumption that deeper wells are protected more. But what we would like to do now is make it more scientifically defensible by incorporating more site-specific data on determining the actual aquifer that the well is withdrawing water from, and then using other data to determine how confined the aquifer is at that location. And then our well integrity and construction rating, that's part of the inherent vulnerability side of the model. I'm not going to get into that just due to time, but the main gist of this slide is just to let you know that we are using our drinking water state revolving fund set-asides to help us update our SWAT model and make it more relevant and more scientifically defensible going into the future. Now I'm going to talk about our source water protection planning. We do have a voluntary source water protection planning program. Right now, there are 10 approved plans that cover 13 systems, which are protecting approximately 440,000 people served by those systems. This is a voluntary program, as opposed to what I'm going to talk about next, which is our mandatory source water protection program. This program is more proactive. It involves, plans or water systems that create and develop these voluntary plans. They set up stakeholder groups and do thorough PCS or potential contaminant source inventories, and develop proactive management strategies to manage those potential contaminant sources. But we also in North Carolina have a mandatory source water protection requirement that came about back in 2014 with the passage of House Bill 894, which resulted in General Statute 130A 320C, requiring any supplier of water that operates a public water system furnishing water from surface supplies to have a source water protection plan. So this applies in North Carolina. This applies to all water systems that use surface supplies for their source water, independent of how their size or what type of system they are. They must have this source water protection plan. And we did go through the rulemaking process to adopt rules for this in our administrative code that is Rule 1305. And that rule became effective in January of 2019. And as has been mentioned earlier, in the fall of 2018, the WIA requirements came out requiring emergency response plans and risk assessments. And EPA released that guidance in August of 2019. And upon reviewing that, we realized that there was quite a bit of overlap between the requirements at our state level in the 1305 rule, as well as in the WIA requirements. So we actually opened the rule back up to amend it to reduce the regulatory burden on our water systems such that they could be able to create one plan that would satisfy both the state requirement and the WIA requirements. And that final rule became effective in April 1 of 2020. And of course, all this process was supported by our drinking water set-asides. Next, I want to just discuss our wellhead protection program. In North Carolina, our wellhead protection program is voluntary. It does exceed the protections that are provided by our state regulatory programs. So here in North Carolina, we have a groundwater protection program that is a regulatory framework, and it's designed to preserve our groundwater sources for their intended best use, which is for drinking water. And it is viewed as an adequate baseline for protecting our state's groundwater resources. But for systems and municipalities and local governments that want to go above and beyond and provide an additional layer of protection, they can develop a voluntary wellhead protection plan. And since it is voluntary, we have set up an incentive that gives priority ranking points to systems that have an approved wellhead protection plan, so that they get priority ranking points when they're seeking loans and grants through our Division of Water Infrastructure, which is part of the infrastructure part of the revolving fund. But now they're only able to get those priority ranking points if their wellhead plan has been approved within the last 5 years. So we do encourage updating their wellhead protection plans at least once every 5 years. We also we have entered and continue to enter into contracts with our North Carolina Rural Water Association for them to provide staff to help assist local governments and water systems in developing these voluntary wellhead protection plans. And those contracts are funded through the state revolving fund set-asides. And this is just a slide showing our wellhead protection areas across the state. As you see, most of them are in our coastal plain area. We do have 171 public water systems that have approved wellhead protection plans. Next, I want to talk about our North Carolina Source Water Collaborative Awards program. Each year we do present awards to or for projects that demonstrate commitment to source water protection, innovative approaches and that type thing to source water protection. It is done through a nomination form that is available on our website. Nominations are submitted. We do review those, and there are 6 award categories, as you see here, for groundwater planning, groundwater implementation, surface water planning, surface water implementation, education, and leadership. And the award is this water drop trophy and certificate that's framed, as you see here in the lower right. Since 2015, we have awarded 27 projects across the state. This slide shows the location of those projects. This past spring, we had 3 award recipients that were recognized. We always do that at our North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute's annual conference. It's a pretty large event. This year it was virtual, but usually it's in person. It's a large event, and it's a good platform to get recognition for the work that the people or the systems have been doing on these projects to protect their source water. And this is just a slide, just shows an example from one of the award recipients projects. It was with the city of Durham. in partnership with the Triangle Land Conservancy and the Eno River Association. They received an award for surface water implementation. And what they were doing, they had identified and prioritized some parcels of land in their water supply watershed for protection, and using fee simple and conservation easement approaches, they have protected these 4 tracts of land within the last year. I think that was around 300 acres in their water supply watershed that is being protected from development. And interesting enough, on this City of Durham application, they originally, back in 2018, they received a surface water planning award for a GIS model that they had created to identify and prioritize parcels of land in their water supply watershed to identify where they would get the most bang for the buck, so to speak, in protecting land in their source water protection area. So they received a planning award in 2018, and now they've received an implementation award this year implementing that plan. So I did want to point that out. We do have that occurring, and we think that's a great idea, a great process to get both the planning and implementation recognized. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit on our collaboration with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. As many of you are probably aware, NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service, they have put an emphasis on source water protection over the past few years, both with the 2018 Farm Bill, requiring at least 10% of their conservation funding outside of their conservation reserve program being put toward source water protection. So here recently, they have really increased the emphasis on using their conservation funds to provide protection to source waters. But North Carolina, we have been working with our NRCS State Technical Advisory Committee for some time, even before that emphasis. And through working through that State Technical Advisory Committee with NRCS and their associated subcommittees, we were able to get some priority ranking points. NRCS included some priority ranking points in their ranking forms for their EQIP program, which is their flagship cost share program for working ag lands that includes a lot of best management practices that improve and protect water quality, as well as we did get some priority ranking points also for their ag easement program. So projects that are located in source water assessment areas do get these priority ranking points with those associated programs. So we were real happy to work with them and get that in place. We've also worked with them on the National Water Quality Initiative. That's one of their programs that's water quality related. We did work with them on selecting 3 watersheds in the state for participation in this program. And our desire there was to make sure that the watersheds that were selected did have good coverage of source water assessment areas. So there would be a strong source water protection component to those selections. And we also worked with them on the 2018 Farm Bill source water priority areas that were required through that 2018 Farm Bill. This slide here, it shows the 3 NWQI watersheds that we work with NRCS and our State Water Quality Agency on selecting. As I said before, they do have a good coverage of source water assessment area. And if you look at the Lower Indian Creek, which is the bottom watershed, this is just a close-up of that watershed showing the watershed in blue, and then our source water assessment areas in orange. You see it both covers for the city of Cherryville and the town of Dallas. Both of those have assessment areas in that watershed, and the total coverage of assessment area in that watershed was 37%. So we were real glad to be able to work with the selection process on these watersheds to advocate for source water protection within the NWQI program here in North Carolina. And This slide here just shows where we work with NRCS on the 2018 Farm Bill requirement. That requirement I mentioned earlier, about 10% of their conservation funding going towards source water protection. One of the requirements they had to do was select local priority areas. And back in 2019, we worked with them. We provided source water assessment data to them and met with them numerous times to ensure that we selected local priority areas, which are shown here in red, these 19 counties that had good coverage of source water assessment areas. And then last year in 2020, they were required, NRCS was required to refine those areas based on HUC 12 boundaries. So we worked with them again last year to identify these 8 watersheds shown in blue, which are HUC 12 watersheds. Again, we made sure, that there was a good coverage of source water assessment areas with these watersheds. And we look to work with them again this year to maybe identify some more watersheds and refine those priority areas even more. This slide here just shows our staff in the drinking water protection program here in North Carolina. Rebecca Sadowski is our operations branch head. Many of you may know her. Brad Whitman, who is on the call with me today, he is our drinking water protection program coordinator. And I want to thank Brad for his assistance in putting together this slideshow today. And like I say, he is on the call with me today and may be helping me out with some questions later on. Sean McGuire is our GIS specialist, and Jeff Talbot is our unregulated contaminant program coordinator. And with that finishes up my presentation. And I guess I'll turn it back over next for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. And I know that we are out of time, but we did have some really good questions come in. So I wanted to ask the presenters if you guys would stay for a couple more minutes to answer some of those questions.
Absolutely,
Brian,
I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, awesome. And then for attendees, obviously, if you have somewhere to go, you can definitely do so. We will be sending out a recording, in a couple of weeks. And again, if you have any remaining questions after Danny's presentation, please feel free to send those to the chat box. So let's just kind of dive right into it. So this question goes to Brian and Vina for Tennessee. So have there been any trends with compliance for water systems that have developed and implemented protection plans for every 3 years? Are the compliance trends, does it seem like the data showing that they're decreasing, increasing, kind of staying the same?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned a little bit about the fact that we see kind of a wide variety of product with those protection plans. We put more emphasis in the recent years about the requirements and taking more attention into approvals. I will say that systems that have the more robust plans that are more engaged to provide a very good product on those, they are much more engaged with respect to implementing other types of protection. Those may be local ordinances, or just paying very close attention to, land that may be able to be bought within that area. Like was mentioned with Danny, some of the systems over in East Tennessee that have springs, we have a really good example where they were very mindful to kind of watch land as it came up for sale. And so I'll just say that not necessarily with respect to, because much of the compliance data is really with respect to, the treatment of water and having compliance on that side of things, but with respect to the overall benefit of source water protection in their watersheds and or groundwater protection agencies or groundwater protection areas, those systems that put more energy into their plans, those are the places where we're seeing the better energy put into also just those local ordinances or other activities to protect water in those local municipalities or towns.
Great, thank you so much. And then this one I believe was directed for Danny, but I think also Brian, you could possibly answer that this question, which is What are the most helpful GIS indicators or GIS data that would help you further that would help further your source water protection program? So drought levels, potential sources of contamination, PFAS levels. What are the sort of indicators that are most helpful to you in your view?
Well, I think the PCS data is very helpful. Of course, we get most of our PCS data from state and federal databases. As far as USGS type data that we get from them, we do get, they do calculate what's called a vertical hydraulic conductance parameter that is basically quantifies or characterizes how easily water moves through the unsaturated zone to the water table for our groundwater sources. So that data is very helpful in helping us with source water protection and identifying areas that are more susceptible to contamination. But as far as like one particular piece of data that sticks out, I can't necessarily say that. I don't know, Brad, if you want to provide any input on that or not.
Yeah, I can't think of any one piece of data that sticks out, Danny.
Okay, I hope that answer helps.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in as well. I think the thing that we're seeing right now as we develop our model is that, there are, when we're looking at those PCSs, like Danny mentioned, that's a very important component of the data. And as we're evaluating state databases, looking at the attributes that we can use from those different types of sites. And so whether those be remediation sites or solid waste management sites, looking at the attributes that really tell us more about how we can use a scoring matrix on those sites, new information that may not have been available in the early 2000s to really rank those more specifically. In addition to that, I'll just say, as Danny mentioned, there are many new data layers available, with new LIDAR, with new hydrogeologic condition data, soils data. A lot of those things can feed into these models to really make better decisions, whether it's, for porous media aquifers or for karst systems or even just surface water. So.
Thanks, guys. And sort of speaking of like methodology, so someone wrote in that EPA approved the methodology for completing source water assessments for every state back in, late 1990s, early 2000s. Are your updates still following the original approved EPA plan, or have you come up with a new process or methodology? If you do have a new methodology, what was sort of the process of developing that, and has it been approved by EPA?
I'm assuming that question is directed at me. Is that right?
I think it was directed for Tennessee, but if you have something to contribute to that,
I'm sorry. I don't want to steal Tennessee's thunder. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good.
No, and I was going to say that Danny may have a better perspective because we're kind of in the throes of all that right now. And our plan is to kind of start at the base with what was approved back then, and then kind of creating the model 2.0, taking that, leveraging new data in a way that can help us make better decisions. But I think Danny probably does have a better perspective with regard to having already implemented his model.
Yeah, what we've been doing, pretty much our updates that we've made so far have been updates to the component data, things like land use, land cover, not really major updates to the model itself. We are in the process, as I said earlier, of doing that, but we've not completed that process. So all of our assessments that we have created and updated over the past have been based on what was approved originally. But as we navigate this new update that we're currently involved in now, there may need to be, depending on how that shakes out in the end, there may need to be some approval updates with that, but we have not reached that point yet.
All righty. And then another question for Danny specifically, how exactly did the DWSRF set-asides assist with rulemaking process in North Carolina? Which set-asides did you use?
Well, I think that would be pretty much from, and Brad, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, related to staff funding, the set asides pretty much they support all of our initiatives that we're involved in. But for that particular one, I would think that would be related to staff funding. Brad, if you want to chime in on that, if I'm incorrect, please feel free to do so.
No, that's correct, Danny. Essentially, our drinking water protection program staff were involved in the rulemaking process, and as Danny's already said several times, our program is funded by set asides.
All righty, thank you. And then I'm just going to have one last question. Have there been any security concerns with sensitive information like well locations being made available to the public through online GIS viewers? And if so, how has North Carolina and Tennessee handled this issue or this potential issue?
Well, for us, like our online mapping application that I showed, you did see that we did have feature symbols for our drinking water sources, but on that, we do have some of the features disabled, such as lat and long, aerial imagery is disabled. So there has been an effort to make it more difficult, I guess, to get exact locations of our drinking water sources from a security standpoint. That would be my answer to that. Brian, I don't know, what you guys have dealt with on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, and something that we continue to evaluate. One thing is that we have state rule as well as some of the other restrictions for data access that you might be well aware of on the federal level that restricts us from providing any of that information. So the source water protection plans are confidential, the locations are confidential, even the area extent is confidential. And so what we've done mainly to provide support to our partner agencies is provide memorandums of understanding. So we have those in place for the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Department of Ag, Tennessee Department of Ag, USGS. And so making sure that we're able to share that information with the important agencies that we need to collaborate with was number one on my list. And so we got those all through, all the legal review back and forth and so forth, and are able to share that data. So that was very important for us initially. I still recognize the challenge with respect to making data more available. We currently would not be providing information like Danny is able to on a web viewer. I think he has come up with a great solution such that maybe that's extent visibility and base maps and those things. So I think those are some good options as well.
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially thank you to our presenters today. You did a really great job. And thanks for sticking around to answer some of those questions that were submitted to us. So thank you guys for attending. As a reminder, we will be posting a recording online, and we'll be sending it out to all the registered attendees. And for the attendees, if you don't mind spending another minute or two, we do have a quick survey for you guys. The first one is, did you experience any technical difficulties participating in the webinar? Did the materials presented achieve your learning objectives? Post-webinar, do you intend to refer to the materials presented? And would a follow-up or an extended training be helpful on this subject? So we'll leave that up for a couple of minutes as the remaining attendees are here. But again, a special thank you to Kara, Vina, Brian, and Danny for presenting. Y'all did a really great job. So thank you guys so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.